A lab notebook logged a leafless vine leaning toward a plant it couldn't see. By the end, you'll know how this thread of a plant hunts by scent, drains another plant dry, and even smuggles genes across the wound, and why that last part unsettles the people who study it. The vine is dodder, a tangle of bright orange strands with no real leaves and almost no green to feed on. Snap a strand, and you find no roots, no anchor in the soil at all. By every rule you were taught, it should starve within days. Instead, it smothers whole fields, orange rope on orange rope, living on ground it never touches, because it survives on other plants, not on soil. But that phrase, living on other plants, hides the real question. How does a rootless, near-blind strand of orange find a victim in the first place, latch on, and pull an entire lifetime of food out of it? The full story is stranger than a plant that simply leans on a neighbor for support. Stay with the record, because the first people to watch this happen refused to believe their own eyes. The first hard report came out of a plant science lab at Penn State in 2006. Researchers there were testing a question that sounds almost childish. Can a plant smell? They took dodder seedlings, the species Cuscuta pentagona, and gave each one a choice. On one side sat a healthy young tomato plant. On the other, nothing but a bare pot, or a plastic plant dressed up to look real. A dodder seedling sprouts as a single pale thread with only a few days of stored energy and no host to feed it. It sweeps in slow circles, blind, searching for something to climb. And in trial after trial, recorded by time-lapse camera, the thread bent toward the tomato. Not toward the light, not toward the plastic decoy, toward the living plant, even when a screen kept the seedling from ever seeing it. Then the team piped only the tomato's airborne scent into a sealed chamber, with no plant in sight, and the dodder still turned to follow the smell. And what this vine does after it lands is stranger still than the way it hunts. To other botanists at the time, the claims sounded impossible. Plants were not supposed to have preferences, let alone a sense that works like smell. But there was one detail in that footage that made the report very hard to wave away. The detail was direction. A root drifts toward moisture, and a shoot drifts toward light, and both are slow, general leanings. The dodder's turn was neither. It aimed, curving straight at the tomato from across the pot, as if it already knew where the plant stood. Skeptics offered gentler explanations. Maybe the seedling was chasing humidity rising off the leafy plant. Maybe it followed a faint warmth, the heat of living tissue. Maybe the plastic decoy simply lacked some ordinary cue any real object would give off. Each idea was reasonable. Each one failed a test. When the team put the tomato behind a barrier that let scent through but blocked heat and moisture, the dodder still turned toward it. When they pulled out the specific airborne chemicals a tomato releases and offered those alone, painted on a swab, the seedling grew toward the swab. And a plastic plant, warmed and misted to fake a living one, drew nothing at all. The vine was not chasing heat or water. It was following a recipe of scent, a blend of volatile compounds drifting off the host. And it could even tell a tomato's blend from a wheat plant's, and preferred the richer target. That should have ended the argument. It did not, because smelling a victim is a long way from surviving off one, and no one had yet watched closely what the thread did the moment it made contact. A dodder vine coils around a stem, then drills straight into its plumbing. Once the thread touches a host it can use, it wraps tight and grows small pegs, called haustoria, hard against the host's skin. Each peg pushes inward until it reaches the two pipelines every plant runs: the xylem that carries water up from the roots, and the phloem that carries sugar down from the leaves. The dodder splices into both, and its tissue fuses so completely that dye injected into the host climbs straight up into the vine within hours. From that moment it drinks the host's water and eats the host's sugar, living on food the victim built for itself. And now that it has a living supply line, the dodder lets its own thin roots wither and die. It has no more use for soil. The proof was never just a photograph. When researchers tagged the host's sap with tracers, the labels piled up inside the dodder, as if the vine were a straw sunk into a glass. One dodder can throw dozens of these connections into a single host and bridge to several plants at once, pulling from all of them. A badly infected crop can lose so much sugar and water that it stops setting fruit and dies beneath a blanket of orange. This was the hard evidence no skeptic could talk away. Not a lean, not a preference, but a permanent, measured, plumbed-in connection. But tapping the victim's pipes turned out to be only the surface of what crosses that junction. The junction did more than move food and water. In 2014, a team at Virginia Tech studied dodder growing on two hosts, a tomato and a small labweed called Arabidopsis, and sequenced everything crossing the connection. They expected sugar and water. What they found was messenger RNA, the short-lived working copies a cell makes whenever it switches a gene on, pouring both directions across the wound. Not a trickle. Thousands of these gene messages moved from host into parasite, and thousands moved back from parasite into host. In some tissues, nearly half of certain host messages were being shared with the vine. Here was a second lab, a second instrument, and a second host pointing at the conclusion the first study only hinted at. Dodder was not merely a straw. It was spliced into the host control system, reading, and perhaps rewriting, the instructions that tell a plant what to do. Later work went further, and it landed exactly where the opening record promised. The vine does not only drink its host, it keeps pieces of it. Researchers found stretches of host DNA, whole genes, and not just messages, lodged permanently inside dodder's own genome. Dozens of them, carried off from victims long dead. A parasite had been quietly pocketing its host's genetic code for millions of years. The confirmation was independent, repeated, and very hard to explain away. A dodder vine can wire several plants together and carry their alarm signals between them. Because one vine often bridges many hosts at once, it turns separate, unconnected plants into a single living circuit. In one experiment, researchers let caterpillars attack one plant in such a network, and the other plants, linked only through the dodder, switched on their own chemical defenses, warned across the parasite's bridge. The thief that robs its hosts also, without meaning to, carries messages between them. So the field has quietly settled on something stranger than a simple parasite. Dodder is a conduit, tapped into its host's internal signaling, not just their sap. It even reads a host's flowering signal and times its own blooming to match, setting seed at the exact moment its victim does. How it pulls off that timing is still being untangled. What is not in doubt is the scope. A single orange strand that began as a rootless seedling can end up plugged into a whole neighborhood of plants, feeding on them, listening to them, and sinking itself to their lives. Farmers know it as a ruinous weed that can strip a field bare. A growing number of botanists describe it in the language of networks and information rather than the language of theft. And yet one thing about this vine still resists every explanation. There is no brain in a dodder, no nerves, no eyes, only a thread of cells with almost no green in it. Yet it smells a victim across open air, picks the richer one, plumbs into its body, reads its private messages, and pockets its genes. We can measure every step and still not say how a rootless strand decides. The case stays open.